Glass shattered against Elizabeth's pristine uniform as billionaire Richard Blackwood's voice cut through the sudden silence. "You're nothing, and you'll always be nothing." Security dragged her into the rain, the mansion gates closing behind her. 10 years later, Elizabeth straightened her designer suit in the elevator ascending to the federal building. The agent's voice echoed, "Mrs. Blackwood is ready to meet with you now." Her fingers brushed the old employee badge hidden in her pocket, the only thing he'd let her keep that night. The man who had destroyed her life had no idea she now held the power to destroy his. Elizabeth Morgan's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the crystal champagne flutes on the silver tray. 15 glasses, perfectly aligned, catching the light from the chandeliers that hung like frozen rain above the marble floors of the Blackwood estate. She'd been dreading this night for weeks, Richard Blackwood's annual celebration of his company's success, where the richest and most powerful people in the city gathered to toast their collective brilliance. "For God's sake, hurry up with those." Richard's voice boomed across the foyer. Elizabeth glanced up to see him adjusting his perfectly tailored tuxedo in one of the ornate mirrors lining the wall. At 53, Richard Blackwood commanded attention. Silver-streaked dark hair, patrician features hardened by decades of ruthless business dealings, and eyes that calculated everyone's worth in dollars and cents. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," Elizabeth replied softly, 7 years of practiced deference evident in her tone. She straightened her simple black uniform with its crisp white collar, the uniform that marked her as invisible to the people who would soon fill these rooms. Richard barely glanced at her as he strode past, the scent of expensive cologne lingering in his wake. "And make sure the caterers don't screw up the oysters like last time. I won't have anything less than perfection tonight." Elizabeth nodded, though he wasn't looking. She'd learned long ago that Richard didn't require responses so much as immediate obedience. Her thoughts drifted momentarily to her daughter Sophia, who was spending the evening with Mrs. Cabrera from apartment 3B. At 16, Sophia was growing into a thoughtful, determined young woman. Everything Elizabeth had fought for since arriving, in this country with nothing but hope and the infant cradled in her arms. The first guests began arriving at 8 o'clock sharp, stepping from luxury cars into the warm summer evening. Elizabeth moved efficiently through the growing crowd, invisible except when needed, collecting empty glasses and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Years of experience had taught her how to anticipate needs before they arose, how to remain in constant motion without ever appearing hurried. "Beautiful home," she overheard a woman in a shimmering blue dress comment to Richard. "The restoration work on those ceiling murals must have cost a fortune." Richard laughed, the sound practiced and hollow. "When you want the best, you pay for tea. Just closed a deal that makes tonight's little soiree look like pocket change." Elizabeth knew the deal he was referencing, the Riverside Development Project. She'd overheard enough phone calls while dusting his study to know that Richard had manipulated zoning laws and pressured officials to force out hundreds of families from their homes to build luxury condominiums. Her own landlord had recently doubled the rent, part of the ripple effect of Richard's urban renewal vision. By 10 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Elizabeth was returning from the kitchen with a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres when she noticed Richard deep in conversation with Mayor Harrison in a quiet corner of the main hall. She slowed her pace, years of survival instincts making her ears perk up. "The environmental review is just a formality," the mayor was saying, voice low. "My people will make sure it passes. Those wetlands aren't worth the paper the regulations are printed on." Richard nodded, slipping what looked like an envelope into the mayor's inner jacket pocket. "I knew I could count on you, James. The campaign contribution we discussed should help with your re-election bid." Elizabeth averted her gaze as they looked up, continuing her path through the room as if she hadn't heard a thing. Another secret to add to the mental file of Richard Blackwood's indiscretions she'd accumulated over the years. Not that it mattered. Who would believe the word of a housekeeper against one of the most powerful men in the city? As midnight approached, Elizabeth was preparing to serve the special reserve champagne for the final toast when disaster struck. One of the catering staff, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, bumped into her while rushing with a tray of seafood. Elizabeth managed to steady herself, but one glass tumbled from her tray, shattering on the Italian marble tile. With a crash that seemed to silence the entire party, she dropped to her knees immediately, frantically gathering the larger shards as conversations slowly resumed around her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though no one was paying attention. No one except Richard Blackwood, He materialized beside her, his patent leather shoes inches from her fingertips. "What the hell is this?" His voice was quiet, but laced with venom. "An accident, Mr. Blackwood. I'll clean it up right away." Elizabeth kept her eyes down, heart hammering against her ribs. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." She raised her face, meeting his cold gaze. The room hadn't fallen silent again, but those nearby were watching with uncomfortable fascination, the kind reserved for witnessing someone else's humiliation. "7 years, Richard said, his lip curling. 7 years you've worked in my home, and you still can't perform the simplest tasks without making a spectacle of yourself." "I'm sorry, sir," Elizabeth repeated, a flush creeping up her neck. The young caterer who had bumped her was nowhere to be seen. Richard lifted one of the remaining champagne glasses from her tray. "This is Baccarat Crystal. Each glass costs more than you make in a day." Without warning, he tilted the glass, pouring the golden liquid deliberately over her uniform. "And this is Cru Clos d'Ambonnet, 1995. Each bottle costs more than you make in a month." Gasps rippled through the nearby guests. Elizabeth remained frozen, champagne soaking through the fabric to her skin, the chill nothing compared to the ice forming around her heart. "Oh, you're nothing," Richard said, voice carrying in the now hushed space. "And you'll always be nothing. Get out of my house." Elizabeth looked up at him, 7 years of accumulated dignity somehow still intact despite the alcohol dripping from her clothing. "Mr. Blackwood." "Security!" Richard barked, turning away as if she'd already vanished. "Remove her from the premises. Immediately." 2 men in dark suits appeared at her sides, not rough but insistent as they helped her to her feet. "Come with us, ma'am," the taller one murmured, almost apologetically. As they escorted her through the kitchen and toward the service exit, Elizabeth caught sight of herself in a stainless steel refrigerator door, hair pinned neatly back, posture still straight despite everything, champagne staining her uniform like a map of tears she refused to shed. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against the cobblestone driveway. One of the security guards handed her the small plastic bag containing her few personal items from the staff locker. "Do you need us to call you a cab?" he asked, professional but not unkind. Elizabeth shook her head. "No, thank you." Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the small photo of Sophia she always carried, her daughter's smile untouched by the night's humiliation. The security guards exchanged glances, but said nothing more as they returned inside. The mansion's gates closed behind her with a heavy metallic clang as Elizabeth stood in the increasing downpour, her uniform growing heavier with each passing moment. Inside, through the grand windows, the party continued as if nothing had happened, crystal and silver still gleaming, laughter bubbling up like the champagne in their glasses. But something had happened. Something had shifted within Elizabeth, Morgan as she clutched her daughter's photo, rain mingling with tears she finally allowed to fall. The woman who walked away from the Blackwood estate that night was not the same one who had entered it 7 years ago, nor was she the same one who had arranged champagne flutes just hours earlier, as lightning flashed overhead, illuminating her solitary figure on the empty street. Elizabeth made herself a silent promise that would alter the course of her life forever, and eventually Richard Blackwood's too. What she couldn't possibly know as she began the long walk home was that today's ending was merely setting the stage for a much more dramatic final act, one where she would hold all the power and Richard Blackwood would be the one left with nothing. The rain had soaked Elizabeth to the bone by the time she reached the bus stop 3 miles from the Blackwood estate. Her uniform clung to her skin, the champagne stain now diluted, but still unmistakably there, a mark of shame that seemed to burn despite the evening chill. The last bus had departed hours ago. Of course it had. Elizabeth checked her wallet. $7 and some change. Not enough for a taxi across town to her small apartment in the East District. She began walking, each step heavier than the last, her mind replaying Richard Blackwood's words on endless loop. "You're nothing and you'll always be nothing." The city streets grew progressively narrower and darker as she left the affluent neighborhood behind. By the time Elizabeth turned onto her block, it was past 2 in the morning. Mrs. Cabrera opened her door before Elizabeth even knocked, concern etched across her weathered face. "Dios mio, what happened to you?" The older woman ushered her inside, where Sophia was asleep on the worn couch. "I lost my job," Elizabeth whispered, the word sticking in her throat. "Mr. Blackwood fired me." "Mrs." Cabrera crossed herself. "That man is the devil. Come, you need dry clothes." She hesitated. "Did he hurt you?" Elizabeth shook her head. though the question made her consider that emotional wounds could bleed just as profusely as physical ones. Not in the way you're asking. After changing into borrowed clothes and gently waking Sophia, Elizabeth made the final climb to their third-floor apartment. Her daughter was too sleepy to ask questions, but the heaviness in Elizabeth's movements told its own story. Once Sophia had fallen back asleep in their shared bedroom, Elizabeth sat at their tiny kitchen table, head in her hands. The job at the Blackwood estate had paid well enough to keep them afloat. Rent, food, Sophia's school supplies, and even a small savings account that Elizabeth had been building, dollar by precious dollar, toward her daughter's college education. Now it was all gone. 7 years of swallowed pride, of being invisible, of pretending not to hear the cruel comments about immigrants and the help. 7 years erased by one shattered glass and a man's wounded ego. Elizabeth didn't sleep that night. By dawn, she had calculated their remaining resources, $843 in savings, enough for 1 month's rent with barely anything left for food. She would need to find work immediately. But dawn also brought another revelation, one that sent ice through her veins. When she checked her phone, there was a text message from her landlord. Rent increasing to $1,150 starting next month. Building under new management. Pay or vacate by the 31st. Nearly double what she was currently paying. Elizabeth's hands shook as she set down the phone. This wasn't coincidence. This was the West Side Development Project reaching her neighborhood. Richard Blackwood's tentacles extending into every aspect of her life. "Mom? What's wrong?" Sophia stood in the doorway, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't slept well either. Elizabeth forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just thinking about some changes we need to make." "Because you lost your job?" Sophia asked quietly. "I heard you telling Mrs. Cabrera." Something in her daughter's voice, understanding beyond her years, broke Elizabeth's composure. Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I'll find something else. I promise we'll be okay." Sophia crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders. "I know we will. We always are." The next 2 weeks became a blur of rejection and mounting desperation. Elizabeth applied for every housekeeping and service position she could find. Each interview seemed promising until the moment they called her references. Then came the sudden apologies. The positions mysteriously filled, the promises to keep her resume on file. After the 8th such rejection, Elizabeth confronted the hiring manager at a downtown hotel. "Please tell me the truth. What did he say about me?" The woman hesitated, glancing around before lowering her voice. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but Mr. Blackwood's office called. They said you stole jewelry, that you were fired for theft." The accusation struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. "That's a lie. I believe you," the manager interrupted gently. "But my hands are tied. His company owns shares in this hotel chain. I'm sorry." By the end of the month, Elizabeth and Sophia had been evicted. Their few possessions, clothes, Sophia's school books, family photos from the old country were crammed into 2 suitcases that they dragged to a women's shelter downtown. The place was clean but crowded, with strict rules and little privacy. "It's just temporary," Elizabeth promised as they settled onto adjacent cots. "Just until I find work." But days turned into weeks. Sophia's school performance began to slip. The girl withdrawing into herself as playground taunts about living in a shelter took their toll. Elizabeth took whatever day labor she could find, washing dishes, cleaning offices, anything to put a few dollars in her pocket. Then came the night that pushed Elizabeth to her breaking point. Returning to the shelter, after a 12-hour shift mopping floors at a factory, she found Sophia huddled on her cot, face bruised, and school backpack missing. Some girls followed. "Me," Sophia explained through tears. "They said shelter kids don't deserve nice things." That night, after Sophia had finally fallen asleep, Elizabeth slipped out of the shelter and walked to the river. She stood on the bridge, staring down at the dark water below, Richard Blackwood's words echoing in her mind. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was nothing. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly, the cool night air rushing past her ears. It would be so easy to make the pain stop, to surrender to the crushing weight of it all. "Mom?" A text message illuminated her phone screen. "Where are you? I woke up and got scared." Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she read Sophia's message. She stepped back from the edge, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She might be nothing to Richard Blackwood, but to Sophia she was everything. And for that reason alone, Elizabeth Morgan would find a way to survive. And eventually, to rise from these ashes stronger than before. What she couldn't know, standing on that bridge between despair and determination, was that this darkest moment would one day be the foundation of a reckoning that would shake Richard Blackwood's empire to its core. Elizabeth's hands shook as she texted back, "Coming, sweetheart. Just needed some air." She cast one final glance at the dark water below before turning away from the bridge railing. The night air felt different now, still cold but somehow clearer, as if her brush with despair had sharpened her senses. Back at the shelter, Elizabeth found Sophia sitting upright on her cot, eyes wide with worry. "I thought you left me," the girl whispered as her mother sat beside her. "Never," Elizabeth promised, pulling her daughter close. "No matter what happens, I will never leave you." She stroked Sophia's hair until the teenager's breathing deepened into sleep, but Elizabeth remained awake, something hardening within her like steel being forged in fire. By morning, Elizabeth had made a decision. They couldn't continue like this, living day to day, scrambling for scraps while Richard Blackwood's shadow loomed over their lives. She needed a plan, something more substantial than minimum wage jobs that barely kept them fed. "We're going to the library today," she told Sophia over their meager breakfast of shelter-provided oatmeal. "There's something I need to research." The downtown public library was warm and quiet, a sanctuary of knowledge open to all regardless of status. Elizabeth settled Sophia at a study table with homework before finding a computer terminal. With trembling fingers, she typed GED preparation courses. For 7 years, Elizabeth had put her own education on hold, working endless hours to provide for Sophia. Now she saw that without credentials, she would remain trapped in the same cycle of poverty and vulnerability that had allowed Richard Blackwood to crush her so easily. "Can I help you find something?" A librarian's voice startled Elizabeth from her thoughts. I need to finish my high school education," Elizabeth admitted, the words difficult to speak aloud, "and maybe find a way to attend college afterward." The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, spent the next hour showing Elizabeth resources, free GED classes at the community center, scholarship applications for low-income adults, financial aid forms. By the time they finished, Elizabeth had filled a notebook with information and upcoming deadlines. "It won't be easy," the librarian cautioned, "especially if you're working at the same time." "Nothing in my life has ever been easy," Elizabeth replied, a new resolve evident in her voice. That evening, after returning to the shelter, Elizabeth took inventory of their situation. They had $212 left from her last few odd jobs, barely enough for 2 weeks of food if they were extremely careful. The shelter would allow them to stay for another month before their time limit expired. Elizabeth made another painful decision. "Sophia," she said gently, "I'm going to arrange for you to stay with Mrs. Cabrera for a while." Sophia's eyes widened. "You're sending me away, but why?" "I need to work multiple jobs while studying for my GED," Elizabeth explained, fighting back tears. "Mrs. Cabrera agreed to let you stay for reduced rent if I clean her building on weekends. You'll have your own space again, a desk for homework." "What about you?" Sophia demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Where will you be?" Elizabeth couldn't meet her daughter's eyes. "I'll be staying at the women's shelter a bit longer. It's just temporary, I promise." The next morning, they packed Sophia's belongings. The girl was silent during the bus ride to their old neighborhood, her shoulder pressed against the window, deliberately distant from her mother. Mrs. Cabrera welcomed them warmly, showing Sophia the small but clean room she'd prepared. "It has a nice desk for studying," she said, nodding approvingly at Sophia's stack of schoolbooks. When it came time to leave, Sophia clung to Elizabeth with surprising strength. "Don't go," she begged, reverting suddenly to the little girl she'd been years ago. "Please, Mama, don't leave me." Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, whispering reassurances until Sophia's grip loosened. Walking away from that apartment was the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder even than leaving her homeland years before, harder than standing on that bridge contemplating the end of everything. Over the following months, Elizabeth transformed her pain into relentless determination. She secured 3 jobs: morning shifts at a bakery starting at 4 a.m., afternoon office cleaning, and weekend janitorial work at the community college, where she took night classes. She slept only 4 hours each night, often on buses between jobs, sustaining herself on coffee and sheer willpower. The GED instructor, Mr. Patterson, noticed Elizabeth always arrived early despite her exhaustion, sitting in the front row with meticulously completed homework. "You have a natural aptitude for mathematics," he commented after class one evening. "Have you considered accounting?" Elizabeth hadn't, but the seed was planted. Numbers had always made sense to her, budgeting their meager resources, calculating hourly wages versus monthly expenses. Perhaps there was a future there, one with stability and respect. She saw Sophia only on Sundays, their precious hours together spent reviewing homework and sharing simple meals. Elizabeth noticed her daughter watching her with new eyes. Not just love, but growing admiration for her mother's struggle. "My teacher asked what I want to be when I grow up," Sophia told her one Sunday. "I said I want to be strong, like my mum." The words nearly broke Elizabeth. That night, after kissing Sophia goodbye, she wept on the bus back to the shelter. Not from despair this time, but from fierce pride mixed with exhaustion. When Elizabeth took her GED exam 6 months later, she scored in the 98th percentile. Mr. Patterson was waiting when she received her results. "The community college has a scholarship program for exceptional adult learners," he said, handing her an application. "Full tuition, books included. You'd still need living expenses, but for the first time since that rainy night outside the Blackwood estate, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel something like hope, fragile but unmistakable, like the first green shoot breaking through concrete. What she didn't realize was that this moment marked the true beginning of a journey that would eventually lead her back to Richard Blackwood, not as a broken housekeeper, but as someone with the power to make him remember her name. Elizabeth Morgan stood frozen in the community college hallway, the scholarship application clutched in her trembling hands. Full tuition, books included. The possibility of a real education stretched before her like a lifeline thrown into turbulent waters. "The deadline is Friday," Mr. Patterson reminded her gently. "You'll need 2 letters of recommendation. I'd be honored to write one." "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, hardly daring to believe that after months of crushing hardship, something might finally go right. That evening, instead of heading to her night cleaning job, Elizabeth called in sick for the first time. She needed these precious hours to complete the application that might change everything. Sitting at a worn table in the shelter's common area, she poured her life story onto paper, her immigration journey, raising Sophia alone, working 3 jobs while studying for her GED, and her newfound passion for accounting. When Friday came, Elizabeth submitted her application with trembling hands. Now began the agonizing wait. Weeks passed. Elizabeth continued her punishing schedule, baking bread before dawn, cleaning offices in the afternoon, studying whenever she could steal a moment. The constant physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the pain of seeing Sophia only once a week. Though Mrs. Cabrera sent regular updates about her daughter's improving grades, Elizabeth ached with each milestone she missed. One Sunday afternoon, while helping Sophia with a math assignment, Elizabeth noticed bruising on her daughter's wrist. "What happened?" she asked, gently turning Sophia's arm to examine the marks. Sophia pulled away. "Nothing, I fell." Elizabeth recognized the lie immediately. She'd told enough of them herself over the years. "Tell me the truth," she insisted, her voice soft but firm. Tears welled in Sophia's eyes. "Some girls at school, they found out we were split up. They said you abandoned me because I was too much trouble." The words tumbled out between sobs. "When I tried to walk away, they grabbed me." Elizabeth gathered her daughter into her arms, fury and heartbreak warring within her chest. "Listen to me," she said fiercely. "I have never, not for 1 second, abandoned you. Everything I'm doing, every single thing, is to build a better life for us." "I know," Sophia whispered against her shoulder. "I told them that. That's when they grabbed me." That night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Elizabeth sat at Mrs. Cabrera's kitchen table, her head in her hands. The old woman placed a cup of tea before her and sat down heavily. "You are killing yourself," Mrs. Cabrera stated bluntly. 3 jobs, school, no sleep. For what? So that man can win?" Elizabeth looked up sharply. "This isn't about him, isn't it?" Mrs. Cabrera's weathered face creased with concern. "Revenge is a poison you drink yourself, hoping the other person dies." "This isn't about revenge," Elizabeth insisted, though something flickered in her eyes. "It's about survival." The following Wednesday, Elizabeth received a letter from the community college. She waited until her break at the bakery to open it with flour-covered fingers. "Congratulations," it began. The Exceptional Adult Learner Scholarship was hers, a full 2-year program in accounting starting next semester. Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in nearly a year, she allowed herself a moment of pure joy, uncomplicated by fear or exhaustion. That joy, however, was short-lived. The next morning she arrived at the bakery to find it shuttered, a notice on the door announcing new ownership. The business had been acquired by Blackwood Hospitality Group, a subsidiary of Blackwood Enterprises. Elizabeth stared at the familiar logo, nausea rising in her throat. Once again, Richard Blackwood's influence had reached into her life, severing another lifeline. She still had her afternoon cleaning job, but without the bakery income, she couldn't afford to reduce her hours for school. The scholarship covered tuition and books, but not living expenses, not food or the small amount she contributed to Mrs. Cabrera for Sophia's care. That afternoon, desperation drove Elizabeth to a place she'd sworn never to return, the affluent neighborhood where the Blackwood estate dominated the hillside. She wasn't there for Richard, however. She went to see Janet, his wife, who had always been quietly kind during Elizabeth's years of service. The security guard at the gate recognized her. "Mrs. Blackwood isn't home," he said, his expression sympathetic. "And even if she was, Mr. Blackwood has specific instructions about you." "Please," Elizabeth begged. "I just need a reference for a cleaning position. Mrs. Blackwood always said I did excellent work." "I'm sorry," the guard replied. "Mr. Blackwood has made it clear that anyone providing assistance to you will face termination." Elizabeth walked away, defeat weighing on her shoulders. Richard Blackwood's vindictiveness seemed boundless, extending beyond mere firing, to ensure she could never rebuild her life. As she waited at the bus stop, a sleek black car pulled alongside her. The passenger window lowered to reveal Janet Blackwood's elegant profile. "Get in quickly," Janet urged. "My husband has a business dinner. We have 20 minutes at most." Once inside the car, Janet handed Elizabeth an envelope. "It's not much, but it should help. I've also included a reference letter dated before that night. Use it carefully." "Why are you helping me?" Elizabeth asked, bewildered by this unexpected kindness. Janet's perfectly composed face cracked slightly. "Because I know what it's like to be under his thumb." She glanced nervously at her diamond watch. "I should get you back to the bus stop." As Elizabeth stepped out of the car, Janet caught her hand. "Be careful, Elizabeth. Richard, he destroys people who cross him. It's what he does best." That evening, Elizabeth counted the money Janet had given her, enough to cover 3 months of expenses if she was careful. The reference letter was glowing, written on Blackwood estate stationery. For the first time, Elizabeth realized that she wasn't the only victim of Richard Blackwood's cruelty. Janet's haunted eyes had told their own story of isolation and fear beneath the veneer of wealth. Elizabeth carefully tucked the letter and money into her meager savings, a plan beginning to form in her mind. She would use this unexpected gift not just to survive, but to ensure that one day Richard Blackwood would face justice for all the lives he had damaged. What she didn't know was that this encounter with Janet would become crucial evidence years later, when the final reckoning came due. Janet Blackwood's unexpected kindness became the lifeline Elizabeth needed. With the money carefully budgeted and the reference letter securing her a new morning job at a downtown hotel cafe, Elizabeth was finally able to begin her accounting program at the community college. On her first day of classes, Elizabeth sat at the back of the room, her second-hand clothes meticulously pressed, her notebook ready. At 36, she was at least a decade older than most students, their carefree laughter highlighting the weight of experience she carried. "Accounting isn't just about numbers," Professor Martinez announced, pacing at the front of the classroom. "It's about stories. The stories that numbers tell when you know how to read them. Financial statements reveal truths that words often conceal." Elizabeth found herself leaning forward, something stirring within her. For years, she had been invisible to people like Richard Blackwood, a faceless servant easily discarded. But what if she could learn to speak the language that powerful men respected? What if she could use their own tools to hold them accountable? Over the following months, Elizabeth threw herself into her studies with singular focus. While other students complained about complex tax codes or depreciation schedules, Elizabeth absorbed everything hungrily, seeing each concept as another piece of armor in her growing arsenal. Her routine was punishing: morning shifts at the hotel cafe, afternoon classes, evening hours at the office cleaning job, and late nights studying until her eyes burned. She still saw Sophia only on Sundays, though she now had enough stability to call her daughter every evening. "Mom, are you eating properly?" Sophia asked during one such call, concern evident in her voice. "Mrs. Cabrera says you're getting too thin." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Elizabeth assured her, ignoring the hollow feeling in her stomach. The truth was, she often skipped meals to stretch her budget, ensuring that the money she sent to Mrs. Cabrera for Sophia's care was never reduced. One evening, as Elizabeth was cleaning the executive floor of Barrett Financial, another subsidiary of Blackwood Enterprises, she overheard voices from behind a partially open door. "The West Side auditors are getting too close," a man was saying, his voice tense. "If they discover the true construction costs, that's why Richard created the offshore accounts," another voice replied. "According to the paperwork, we paid standard rates. No one can prove otherwise unless they access the Cayman records." Elizabeth slowed her movements, careful not to make a sound as she continued dusting the hallway outside the conference room. And the environmental violations? Buried, literally. The contaminated soil tests were replaced with clean samples. The original reports were shredded. As footsteps approached the door, Elizabeth quickly moved away, pushing her cleaning cart toward the elevators. Her heart hammered in her chest, not from fear of being caught eavesdropping, but from the realization that her accounting classes had given her enough knowledge to understand exactly what she had just heard: fraud, tax evasion, and environmental crimes. That night, instead of studying her assigned textbook chapters, Elizabeth researched offshore banking structures and environmental compliance regulations. A plan, still nebulous but growing more defined with each passing day, was taking shape in her mind. The following week brought another cruel twist of fate. Elizabeth arrived at her hotel cafe job to find the manager, waiting with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. The hotel chain was just acquired by—" "Let me guess," Elizabeth interrupted, bitter resignation in her voice. "Blackwood Enterprises." The manager nodded uncomfortably. "We've been instructed to terminate several employees immediately. Your name was specifically mentioned." Elizabeth stood very still, absorbing this latest blow. Richard Blackwood's vindictiveness seemed limitless, his reach extending into every corner of her life like a malevolent shadow. "He won't stop, will he?" she whispered, more to herself than to the manager. "I've written you an excellent reference," the manager offered, clearly uncomfortable. "Dated last month, before the acquisition. Use it wherever he doesn't have influence." Elizabeth thanked him mechanically, gathering her few belongings from the staff room. Outside, leaning against the hotel's brick wall, she allowed herself exactly 1 minute of despair, 60 seconds to feel the full weight of injustice pressing down upon her shoulders. When that minute ended, Elizabeth straightened her spine and wiped away the single tear that had escaped. Richard Blackwood wanted to break her. She refused to be broken. That evening, Elizabeth visited the campus career center, where she found a job posting for a part-time administrative assistant in the accounting department of a small import-export business. The company was too insignificant to be on Blackwood's radar, and the position would allow her to apply her growing accounting knowledge directly. The interview went well, but as Elizabeth was leaving, she overheard the owner talking on the phone about cash flow problems. Drawing on her recent education, she paused at the door. "Excuse me," she said, returning to the owner's desk. "I couldn't help overhearing. If your issue is with accounts receivable timing, have you considered factoring your invoices?" The owner, a middle-aged woman named Gloria Chen, stared at Elizabeth in surprise. "You know about invoice factoring?" Elizabeth nodded, explaining how the process could help with immediate cash flow needs. By the end of the conversation, not only had she secured the job, but Gloria had increased the hourly rate in recognition of her financial knowledge. That night, for the first time in months, Elizabeth called Sophia with good news. "I found a better job," she explained. "One where I can use what I'm learning, and it pays enough that I might be able to get us an apartment again soon." "Together?" Sophia asked, her voice small but hopeful. "A real home?" "Together," Elizabeth promised. "Just a little longer, sweetheart." What Elizabeth didn't tell her daughter was that each new piece of financial knowledge she acquired, each new understanding of corporate structures and regulatory requirements, was bringing her closer to the day when Richard Blackwood would face consequences for his actions. As she fell asleep that night on her narrow shelter cot, Elizabeth held tight to two promises, one to reunite with her daughter, and one to ensure that men like Richard Blackwood could no longer destroy lives with impunity. 6 months into her accounting program, Elizabeth Morgan had transformed. Knowledge had reshaped her, not just in the confident way she now analyzed financial statements or the precision with which she explained invoice discrepancies to Gloria Chen, but in how she carried herself. The perpetual exhaustion remained, etched in the fine lines around her eyes, but beneath it burned a clarity of purpose that grew stronger each day. "You're my best student," Professor Martinez told her after class one evening. "Have you considered pursuing a 4-year degree after completion of this program?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "One step at a time, Professor, but yes, I've thought about it." What she didn't say was that each step was carefully calculated now, part of a longer journey, whose destination had become increasingly clear: justice. Working at Chen Imports had provided Elizabeth with more than just a steady paycheck. Gloria had come to trust her financial insights, gradually increasing her responsibilities, until Elizabeth was effectively managing the company's books. This position gave her legitimate access to banking systems, invoice processing software, and regulatory compliance protocols, all tools she studied with an intensity that went beyond professional development. That evening, as she cleaned the executive floor at Barrett Financial, Elizabeth made a decision. For months, she had overheard fragments of conversations about questionable business practices. Tonight, she would do more than listen. The office was empty, the executives having departed for a corporate retreat. Elizabeth slipped into the records room, her cleaning cart positioned to block the security camera's view. With gloved hands, she carefully photographed documents left carelessly on desks and in half-open file cabinets, evidence of the environmental violations she'd heard discussed weeks earlier. Her heart pounded as she worked methodically, the small camera hidden in her palm, capturing images of permits with falsified data, soil test results with obvious alterations, and most damning of all, a memo from Richard Blackwood himself instructing staff to handle the situation by any means necessary. Elizabeth had just returned to her cleaning cart when footsteps echoed down the hallway. She quickly resumed mopping, head down in the practiced posture of invisibility she had perfected over years of service work. A security guard rounded the corner, eyeing her suspiciously. "Still here? Everyone else is gone." "Just finishing up," Elizabeth replied, not meeting his gaze. The executive break room had a coffee spill. He seemed satisfied with her explanation, continuing his rounds without further questions. Only when the elevator doors closed behind him did Elizabeth release her breath, her hands trembling slightly as she returned the camera to its hiding place in her uniform pocket. Back at the shelter that night, Elizabeth carefully transferred the photos to a small flash drive, which she sealed in a waterproof bag and hid inside a hollowed-out deodorant stick. It wasn't much yet, fragments of a larger pattern of corruption, but it was a start. The following Sunday, Elizabeth's visit with Sophia was overshadowed by unsettling news. "There's a boy at school who keeps asking about you," Sophia said, her fingers nervously pleating the edge of her shirt. "He says his dad works for Mr. Blackwood and that you're a thief." Elizabeth froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "What did you tell him?" "That he's a liar," Sophia replied fiercely. "I pushed him when he wouldn't stop. Now I have detention all week." "Sophia," Elizabeth sighed, torn between pride in her daughter's loyalty and concern about this new development. "Violence isn't the answer. Neither is letting people lie about you," Sophia retorted, a new hardness in her young face that pained Elizabeth to see. The past year had forced her daughter to grow up too quickly, to develop defenses against a world that could be breathtakingly cruel. That night, as Elizabeth prepared to return to the shelter, Mrs. Cabrera pulled her aside. "Someone was asking questions in the building yesterday," the older woman whispered. "A man in an expensive suit showing your picture." A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. What did he want? He claimed to be from social services, checking on Sophia's welfare, Mrs. Cabrera replied. "But social workers don't wear Rolex watches or drive black SUVs with tinted windows." Elizabeth's mind raced. Richard Blackwood was escalating, moving from merely blocking her employment to actively investigating her life, possibly seeking to interfere with her relationship with Sophia. "We need to be more careful," Elizabeth said, squeezing Mrs. Cabrera's weathered hand. "If anyone else comes asking questions, I know nothing," Mrs. Cabrera assured her firmly. "And neither does anyone else in this building." Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth accelerated her plans. During her accounting classes, she paid special attention to forensic techniques and regulatory reporting requirements. At Chen Imports, she volunteered for projects involving customs documentation, and international wire transfers, building knowledge of systems that might later prove useful. And at Blackwood Financial, she continued her careful documentation of wrongdoing, photographing evidence of tax fraud, labor violations, and bribery of government officials. The flash drive in her deodorant stick grew heavier with secrets. Elizabeth was approaching the end of her 2-year program when disaster struck. Returning to the shelter one evening, she found her few possessions scattered across her cot, her hiding places clearly searched. The hollowed deodorant stick lay discarded on the floor, empty. Cold terror washed over her. The flash drive containing months of meticulous evidence was gone. The shelter supervisor approached, her expression grave. 2 men claiming to be police officers came asking about you. They had a warrant or something that looked like one. She lowered her voice. They didn't look like any cops I've ever seen. Elizabeth sat heavily on her cot, mind racing. If Richard Blackwood had obtained her evidence, he now knew she was gathering information against him. Worse, he knew exactly what she had and what she might know. That night, Elizabeth didn't sleep. Instead, she formulated contingency plans, weighing risks against necessities. By dawn, she had made a painful decision. Sophia would need to be moved immediately. Mrs. Cabrera's apartment was no longer safe. Neither was the shelter. Neither, in fact, was anywhere within Richard Blackwood's sphere of influence, which Elizabeth was discovering extended far beyond what she had imagined. As she walked to her morning class, Elizabeth felt eyes on her. Across the street, a black SUV with tinted windows idled at the curb. The message was clear. She was being watched. Professor Martinez noticed her distraction during class. "Is everything all right, Elizabeth?" he asked, as other students filed out. For a moment, Elizabeth considered telling him everything about Richard Blackwood, the evidence, the escalating threats, but involving others would only put them at risk. "Just tired," she replied with a forced smile. "Final exams coming up." What Elizabeth couldn't yet know was that the flash drive's disappearance, devastating as it seemed, would ultimately become the catalyst for her most decisive action against Richard Blackwood, one that would change everything. Elizabeth's hands shook as she dialed Mrs. Cabrera's number from a public phone booth, unwilling to risk using her own cell phone. "Take Sophia and go to my cousin Maria's apartment in Riverdale," she instructed, her voice low and urgent. "Now, don't pack anything noticeable. Tell no one where you're going." "Dios mío," Mrs. Cabrera whispered. "It's that serious?" "Yes," Elizabeth replied, glancing over her shoulder at the black SUV that had followed her from the community college. "I'll contact you once you're there. Please hurry." After hanging up, Elizabeth walked casually toward the bus stop, then suddenly ducked into a crowded department store. She weaved through racks of clothing, exited through a service door, and sprinted down an alley, her heart hammering against her ribs. For now, she had lost her tail, but she knew it was temporary. The flash drive might be gone, but Elizabeth had been methodical. Months earlier, she had begun emailing select photos to herself using an anonymous account created specifically for this purpose. Not all the evidence, but enough to prove a pattern of corruption. She needed to retrieve it now, before Richard. Blackwood's men located this backup too. At an internet cafe 20 blocks from her usual haunts, Elizabeth logged into the email account. Her breath caught as she saw the inbox. Empty. Every message deleted. She tried the trash folder, the archive. Nothing. Someone had accessed the account and erased everything. Elizabeth stared at the blank screen, despair threatening to overwhelm her. 2 years of careful documentation, gone. Richard Blackwood had anticipated her every move, using his vast resources to neutralize her efforts before she could act. Outside the cafe, rain began to fall, a cruel echo of that night years ago when she'd been expelled from the Blackwood estate into similar weather. But Elizabeth was not the same woman. This time, rain didn't mask tears of humiliation, but cooled the fire of her resolve. She found another payphone and called Gloria Chen. "I need to take emergency leave," Elizabeth explained. "Family crisis." "Is everything all right?" Gloria asked, concern evident in her voice. "No," Elizabeth admitted, "but it will be. I just need time." Her next call was to Professor Martinez, explaining that she would miss her final exams due to a personal emergency. The disappointment in his voice was palpable, but Elizabeth had no choice. Survival came first. By nightfall, Elizabeth had retrieved the small emergency fund she kept hidden in a locker at the bus station and checked into a motel on the edge of town, paying cash under a false name. There, sitting on a bed with springs, that dug into her back, she faced the brutal truth. Richard Blackwood had won this round, but the game wasn't over. The motel room television flickered with local news as Elizabeth contemplated her next move. A story about urban development caught her attention. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, opposing the latest phase of the West Side project. The camera panned across angry faces holding signs, "Stop Blackwood" and "Homes Not Luxury Condos." Elizabeth leaned forward, recognition dawning. She wasn't the only victim of Richard Blackwood's ruthless business practices. An entire community stood against him. People who had lost homes and livelihoods to his development schemes. Her phone rang, a burner she'd purchased that afternoon. Only Mrs. Cabrera had the number. "We're safe," the older woman reported. "But someone came looking for Sophia at school today. The principal called me, concerned about a man claiming to be her uncle." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Is Sophia with you now?" "Yes." "She's scared, Elizabeth." "We both are." "I know. I'm coming to get you, both of you." Elizabeth's mind raced, forming a desperate plan. "We need to leave the city." After ending the call, Elizabeth pulled out the small notebook where she tracked her finances. The emergency fund would cover bus tickets and perhaps 2 months of basic expenses in a new location. After that, she shook her head. After that would have to take care of itself. 3 hours later, Elizabeth arrived at Maria's apartment in Riverdale. Sophia flew into her arms, trembling with fear and relief. "Mom, what's happening?" Mrs. Cabrera wouldn't explain anything. Elizabeth held her daughter tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Someone is trying to hurt us, sweetheart. Someone powerful. We need to go away for a while." Sophia pulled back, her eyes, so much like Elizabeth's own, searching her mother's face. "It's him, isn't it? The man who fired you, Mr. Blackwood." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. No point shielding Sophia from the truth now. "Yes, he's a dangerous man who's done terrible things. I discovered some of those things, and now he's afraid I'll expose him." "So we're running away?" Sophia asked, a note of disappointment in her voice. "No," Elizabeth replied firmly. "We're retreating to regroup. There's a difference." An hour before dawn, Elizabeth, Sophia, and Mrs. Cabrera boarded a bus bound for a small town 300 miles away. They carried only what would fit in their backpacks: clothes, essential documents, and the few mementos they couldn't bear to leave behind. As the bus pulled away from the station, Elizabeth watched the city skyline recede, the Blackwood Tower, prominent among the skyscrapers. Her life's work for the past 2 years, her education, her evidence, her carefully constructed path to justice, lay in ruins behind her. "Where are we going?" Sophia asked, her head resting on Elizabeth's shoulder. As the bus rumbled down the highway, "Millfield," Elizabeth replied. "My roommate from the shelter has family there. They'll help us get settled." "For how long?" Elizabeth stroked her daughter's hair. "I don't know, sweetheart. As long as it takes." Mrs. Cabrera, sitting across the aisle, gave Elizabeth a knowing look. At 68, she had left behind her entire life, her apartment, her friends, her routines, to protect Sophia. The sacrifice was written in the tired lines of her face. "Thank you," Elizabeth mouthed silently to her. The older woman nodded, then turned to look out the window at the passing countryside, perhaps wondering, as Elizabeth was, if they would ever return. By midday, they had arrived in Millfield, a faded industrial town struggling to reinvent itself after the closure of its textile mills. Elizabeth's friend had arranged a small apartment above a hardware store, the rent negotiated in cash with no questions asked. "It's not much," Elizabeth apologized as they climbed the narrow stairs to their new home. "It's ours," Sophia replied, surprising her mother with her resilience. "And we're together." That night, as Mrs. Cabrera and Sophia slept on the single mattress they'd purchased from a thrift store, Elizabeth sat by the window, watching the quiet street below. They were safe for now, but she harbored no illusions. Richard Blackwood had resources that stretched far beyond city limits. This wasn't over. Somehow Elizabeth would find a way to rebuild her evidence, to expose his crimes, to obtain justice, not just for herself, but for all those protesters outside City Hall, for Janet Blackwood with her haunted eyes, for every person Richard had. Crushed beneath his expensive shoes, the how remained elusive, a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Elizabeth simply watched over her sleeping family, the fierce love for them burning alongside her determination for justice. Life in Millfield unfolded in stark contrast to the life Elizabeth had been building. Gone was her accounting program, her position at Chen Imports, her carefully constructed plan for justice. Instead, she found herself working 2 minimum-wage jobs, mornings at a local diner and evenings cleaning offices in the town's modest business district. 6 months passed in this limbo of survival. Sophia had enrolled in the local high school, her academic excellence securing her a place despite their hasty arrival and minimal documentation. Mrs. Cabrera found purpose helping their elderly landlord, Mr. Harmon, tend his small vegetable garden behind the hardware store. They were existing but not living, suspended in a state of constant vigilance that wore on their spirits like sandpaper. "How long are we going to stay here?" Sophia asked one Sunday morning as they shared a rare breakfast together. At 17, she had grown taller, her face losing its childish softness. The hardships of the past years had matured her beyond her age. "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted, the weight of uncertainty heavy in her voice. "Until it's safe." Sophia set down her fork with unexpected force. "And when will that be?" "When Richard Blackwood dies of old age, when I'm 30, when you've spent your entire life running from him." Elizabeth flinched at her daughter's bitter tone. "Sophia, you had evidence against him," Sophia continued, years of frustrated questions finally spilling out. "You could have gone to the police before he found out." "It wasn't that simple," Elizabeth replied, pushing away her untouched coffee. "Richard Blackwood has connections everywhere. Judges, police commissioners, politicians. Without overwhelming proof, any accusation would have been dismissed, and we'd be in even greater danger." Mrs. Cabrera, who had been quietly washing dishes at the sink, turned to face them. "The girl has a point, Elizabeth. How long can we live like this? I'm not getting any younger." Elizabeth looked from her daughter to the elderly woman who had sacrificed everything to protect them. The truth was, she had been asking herself the same question each night as she scrubbed office floors, her hands red and raw from cheap cleaning. "Chemicals. I'm working on a plan," she said finally, "but I need more time." The plan was little more than fragmented hope at this point. Rebuilding her evidence against Richard Blackwood seemed impossible from hundreds of miles away, with no access to Barrett Financial's records or the Blackwood estate. That evening, as Elizabeth cleaned the small law office that was her final stop of the night, she found herself lingering over the legal journals scattered across the senior partner's desk. One article caught her eye: "Whistleblower Protections in Corporate Fraud Cases." She was so engrossed in reading that she didn't hear the door open. "Interesting. A material?" Elizabeth startled, nearly knocking over a stack of files. A woman stood in the doorway, tall with short silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Martha Collins, the office's senior partner, whom Elizabeth had only glimpsed from a distance before. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth stammered, hastily returning the journal to its place. "I was just reading about whistleblower protections," Martha finished for her. Not exactly casual browsing material. Elizabeth remained silent, heart racing. Would she lose this job too? They couldn't afford another setback. Martha studied her with unnerving intensity. "You're overqualified for cleaning offices, aren't you? Your posture when you read legal terminology, the way you organize my chaotic files each night into perfectly logical systems, those aren't skills one picks up pushing a mop." "I should finish my work," Elizabeth said, reaching for her cleaning cart. "Sit down," Martha said, not unkindly but with unmistakable authority. "Please," something in the older woman's tone, professional curiosity rather than accusation, made Elizabeth comply. She perched on the edge of a client chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You're hiding from someone," Martha stated matter-of-factly. "You, the older woman, and the teenage girl who looks just like you. You arrived in Millfield with nothing, took the first jobs available, and keep to yourselves. Classic flight pattern." Elizabeth said nothing, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm not asking for your story," Martha continued, "but I am offering you a job that better matches your abilities. My assistant quit last week. The position includes filing, basic bookkeeping and client scheduling." Elizabeth's head snapped up in surprise. "Why would you offer that to someone you just accused of hiding a suspicious past?" Martha's mouth curved in a slight smile. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Besides, I've been practicing law for 40 years. I can spot desperate people, and I can spot dangerous ones. You're the former, not the latter." The offer was tempting. Better pay, daytime hours that would allow Elizabeth to see Sophia more regularly, work that engaged her mind rather than just her hands. But it also meant greater visibility, a paper trail of employment records. "I can't," Elizabeth said reluctantly. It's too risky. For legal work, I need your real name on payroll documents, Martha acknowledged. But those records can be protected. Attorney-client privilege is a powerful thing. Elizabeth's eyes widened. You're offering to take me on as a client too? Let's just say I'm curious about what would drive someone with your obvious intelligence and education to hide in a town like Millfield. Martha leaned forward. Whatever you're running from, Ms. Morgan? Elizabeth supplied after a moment's hesitation. Elizabeth Morgan. Whatever you're running from, Ms. Morgan, running forever, isn't a sustainable plan. That night, Elizabeth lay awake long after Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera had fallen asleep. Martha Collins represented something Elizabeth had abandoned hope of finding in Millfield, a potential ally with legal knowledge and resources. But trusting anyone after what Richard Blackwood had done felt impossible. The man had eyes everywhere, influence that extended like poisonous roots through all levels of society. How could Elizabeth be certain that Martha Collins wasn't somehow connected to him? By morning, exhaustion had made the decision for her. Elizabeth couldn't continue this way, working herself to the bone in jobs that barely covered their expenses, constantly looking over her shoulder, watching Sophia's youth slip away in this limbo of fear. She called the law office before her. "Diner shift. I'll take the position," Elizabeth told Martha. "But before I do, there's something you need to know about who I'm running from." 2 hours later, in the privacy of Martha's office with the door locked and white noise machines humming to prevent eavesdropping, Elizabeth Morgan told her story, from the night of her humiliation at the Blackwood estate to the evidence she had gathered and subsequently lost. Martha listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Elizabeth finished, silence hung between them, heavy with the magnitude of what had been revealed. "Richard Blackwood," Martha finally said. The name weighted with recognition. "I should have guessed. His reputation extends even to Millfield." "Then you understand why I can't fight him," Elizabeth replied, defeat evident in her voice. Martha's eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "On the contrary, Ms. Morgan, you absolutely can fight him, and I'm going to help you do it. Help me fight." "Richard Blackwood," Elizabeth echoed, disbelief coloring her voice. "You don't understand what you're saying. This man has resources that make him practically untouchable." Martha Collins leaned back in her leather chair, silver hair catching the morning light. "No one is untouchable, Ms. Morgan, not even Richard Blackwood." She opened a drawer and withdrew a thick file. 5 years ago, I represented a small environmental group that challenged one of Blackwood's developments, a resort that would have destroyed protected wetlands. We lost, of course. "Of course," Elizabeth murmured, "but not because—" "Our case lacked merit," Martha continued, tapping the file. "How we lost because key evidence mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses suddenly changed their testimony, and the judge, who had no previous connection to Blackwood that we could find, ruled against us on every motion." She fixed Elizabeth with a penetrating stare. "I've been collecting information on Richard Blackwood ever since, waiting for the right opportunity. Hope, that dangerous emotion Elizabeth had suppressed for so long, flickered to life." "What kind of information?" "Patterns of behavior, business connections, shell companies. Nothing that would stand up in court alone, but combined with what you know." Martha's voice trailed off meaningfully. "Tell me, Ms. Morgan, are you familiar with RICO statutes? Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act?" Elizabeth replied automatically. "Designed to combat organized crime by allowing prosecution of organization leaders for crimes they ordered others to commit." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly. "Your accounting education is showing. It would be nearly impossible to prove," Elizabeth cautioned. "We'd need documentation showing a clear pattern of corruption across multiple businesses, evidence of Blackwood's direct involvement, and witnesses willing to testify." "Exactly what you were collecting before you were forced to flee," Martha pointed out, "and exactly what I've been gathering, albeit more slowly and from a distance." Elizabeth stood, pacing the small office as thoughts raced through her mind. "Even if we combined our evidence, it wouldn't be enough. And the moment we start making inquiries, Blackwood will know. He'll come after us, after Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera. Not if we're smart about it," Martha countered. "Not if we build the case quietly, meticulously, until it's too substantial to be dismantled. Not if we secure federal protection before moving openly." Elizabeth paused by the window, watching pedestrians move along Millfield's quiet main street. The life she'd built here was a shadow existence, a half-life of constant fear and deprivation. How long could she sustain it? How long before Richard Blackwood found them anyway? It would take years, she said softly. Yes, Martha agreed. But you've already given him years of your life. The question is, do you want to spend more years running from him or working toward the day you can stop running forever? That evening, Elizabeth sat down with Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera to share her decision. The tiny apartment above the hardware store felt even smaller as she explained Martha's proposition and the risks it entailed. So we stay in Millfield? Sophia asked, her expression unreadable. For now, Elizabeth confirmed. I'll work for Martha, learning everything I can about building a legal case. We'll be careful, keep a low profile, but yes, we stop running. Mrs. Cabrera crossed herself. And if he finds us before you're ready? Martha has contingency plans, Elizabeth assured. Her though the thought sent ice through her veins. She has connections with a women's advocacy group that helps people disappear from dangerous situations, new identities, relocated to places even Richard Blackwood couldn't find us. Sophia studied her mother's face. You trust her that much? After everything? I have to trust someone, Elizabeth admitted. We can't do this alone. The following Monday, Elizabeth began her new life as Martha Collins's legal assistant. The work was demanding but intellectually stimulating, a welcome change from the physical labor that had occupied her days since arriving in Millfield. More importantly, it gave her access to legal resources, databases, and Martha's extensive network of contacts. Their strategy unfolded deliberately over the following months. Martha used her legitimate legal practice to make inquiries about Blackwood, enterprises that wouldn't raise red flags. Elizabeth pored over financial records, property transactions, and corporate filings, identifying patterns that only someone with her intimate knowledge of Richard Blackwood's operations could recognize. He's expanding again, Elizabeth noted one evening, 6 months into their collaboration. She spread newspaper clippings across Martha's desk. 3 new development projects, all in different states, all using different subsidiary companies, but the same funding structure I saw at Barrett Financial. Martha nodded approvingly. Good catch. His ego makes him predictable, always reaching for more, always using the same methods that have worked before. Their evidence file grew steadily, a complex web of financial malfeasance, environmental violations, labor exploitation, and corruption, linking back to Richard Blackwood. But something crucial was still missing. We need an insider, Martha acknowledged during one late-night strategy session. Someone currently within Blackwood's organization who can testify to his direct involvement, provide documentation we can't access externally. Elizabeth stared into her cooling coffee. That's impossible. Anyone close enough to Blackwood to have that kind of information would never risk crossing him, unless they had their own reasons, Martha mused. Someone he's wronged. Someone with nothing left to lose. A face flashed in Elizabeth's mind, elegant features strained with barely concealed fear. Janet Blackwood, she whispered. His wife? Martha looked up sharply. You think she might help us? Elizabeth recalled their brief encounter years ago, Janet's haunted eyes as she'd confessed to knowing what it was like to be under Richard's thumb. I don't know. It's possible she has her own reasons to want freedom from him, but reaching out to her would be incredibly dangerous, for her and for us. The dilemma remained unresolved as life in Millfield settled into a new rhythm. Sophia flourished in school, earning a prestigious scholarship that would cover her college education. Mrs. Cabrera found community among Millfield's small but vibrant immigrant population. Elizabeth herself began taking online courses to complete her accounting degree, building credentials that would eventually make her expert testimony more credible. 3 years passed this way, years of meticulous preparation, of quiet determination, of lives slowly rebuilt in the shadow of an ever-present threat. The Elizabeth Morgan who had once been humiliated and discarded by Richard Blackwood was gone, replaced by a woman with knowledge, purpose, and growing professional respect within Millfield's small legal community. Then came the day that changed everything. Elizabeth was reviewing case files when Martha burst into the office, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. Turn on the news, she commanded, reaching for the small television they kept on a shelf. The screen filled with helicopter footage of a sprawling mansion surrounded by police vehicles. Elizabeth recognized it immediately. The Blackwood estate. Federal. Agents raided the property this morning, the news anchor was saying. Sources close to the investigation suggest Richard Blackwood is facing charges of tax evasion securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. His whereabouts are currently unknown. Elizabeth stared at the screen, emotions colliding within her. Shock, confusion, and a strange sense of being cheated of something she'd worked toward for years. "I don't understand. This isn't our case. We haven't moved yet. Someone else got to him first," Martha said, dropping into a chair. "The question is who? And what does this mean for our strategy?" As if in answer, the office phone rang. Martha answered, listened briefly, then extended the receiver to Elizabeth with an expression of stunned disbelief. "It's for you," she said. "Janet Blackwood." Elizabeth took the phone with trembling fingers. "Hello?" "Elizabeth Morgan." Janet's voice was taut with strain. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." "How did you find me?" Elizabeth asked, struggling to process this impossible development. "That's not important," Janet replied. "What matters is that my husband is on the run. Federal agents are combing through every aspect of our lives, and I've just learned about your evidence collection from the FBI agent in charge of the investigation." Elizabeth gripped the edge of the desk for support. "You're working with the FBI?" "For the past year," Janet confirmed. "It seems we've been building parallel cases against the same man. The agent thinks our efforts would be stronger combined. He'd like to meet with you." "Meet with me where?" "In the city," Janet said. "It's time for you to come home, Elizabeth. Richard can't hurt you anymore. And there are things you deserve to know. About the night you were fired, about what's happened since." Elizabeth's mind raced with implications, with dangers and possibilities. She looked up to find Martha watching her intently, clearly hearing. "Only one side of this extraordinary conversation. I'll need to discuss this with my family," Elizabeth said carefully. "And my attorney." "Of course," Janet replied. "But don't take too long. Everything is moving quickly now. Richard has resources overseas. If he manages to leave the country..." She left the sentence unfinished. After hanging up, Elizabeth relayed the conversation to Martha, who listened with growing amazement. "It could be a trap," Martha cautioned. "Richard Blackwood could be using his wife to lure you out of hiding. Or it could be our best chance to finally see justice done," Elizabeth countered. "To end this once and for all." That night, she faced the most difficult decision since fleeing the city years before. Return and risk everything they'd built in Millfield, or remain in safety while others brought Richard Blackwood to justice. The answer, when it came, surprised even Elizabeth with its clarity. This had never been about revenge. It had always been about accountability, about ensuring that Richard Blackwood could never again destroy lives with impunity. "We're going back," she told Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera. "It's time to finish what we started." The journey back to the city felt surreal to Elizabeth. Sitting in Martha Collins's sedan with Sophia beside her and Mrs. Cabrera in the back seat, she watched familiar landmarks emerge from the landscape, concrete evidence of a past life she had struggled to leave behind. "Are you okay, Mom?" Sophia asked, noticing her mother's white-knuckled grip on the armrest. Elizabeth managed a tight smile. "Just nervous. It's been a long time." At 20, Sophia had blossomed into a beautiful young woman with Elizabeth's determination reflected in every line of her face. She had graduated high school with honors and deferred her college scholarship to remain with her mother during this crucial time, a sacrifice that Elizabeth felt acutely. They had agreed to meet Janet Blackwood and the FBI agent at a federal building downtown, neutral territory that offered some measure of security. Martha had insisted on accompanying them as legal counsel, her briefcase filled with the evidence they had meticulously compiled over 3 years in Millfield. "Remember," Martha cautioned as they parked, "we say nothing without assurances of immunity and witness protection. If this is legitimate, they'll understand our caution." The federal building loomed before them, its glass and steel facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Elizabeth hesitated at the entrance, memories of her last days in the city crashing over her. The desperate flight, the fear, the uncertainty that had defined years of her life since. "We're with you," Mrs. Cabrera said softly, her weathered hand finding Elizabeth's. "All of us." Inside, they were escorted to a conference room where 2 people waited. Janet Blackwood, elegant as ever, though visibly thinner, and a stern-faced man who introduced himself as Special Agent Donovan. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I understand your reluctance given the circumstances." Elizabeth studied Janet, searching for signs of deception. "Why now? After all these years?" Janet's composure cracked slightly. "Because I finally had enough evidence to act without him knowing, and because I finally found the courage." She pushed a file folder across the table. This contains bank records proving Richard's offshore accounts, documentation of bribes to government officials, and records of environmental violations that he personally ordered. Material similar to what you were collecting, Agent Donovan added, but with Janet's position she had access to the executive level. Her testimony, combined with the evidence, was enough for us to move. Elizabeth opened the folder with trembling fingers. The documents inside represented everything she had sought, proof of Richard Blackwood's crimes, meticulously organized and authenticated. "He destroyed my life," Elizabeth said, her voice barely audible. "Took everything from me. Forced me to abandon my education, my home, my identity." "I know," Janet replied, genuine remorse in her eyes. "I was there that night, Elizabeth. I saw what he did to you." She hesitated. "What you don't know is that your firing wasn't about the broken glass. It was about what you'd overheard the week before, his conversation with Mayor Harrison about the environmental review." Elizabeth's head snapped up. "You knew about that?" Richard had the security office review footage after the mayor mentioned feeling uneasy about discussing sensitive matters where staff could hear. "He saw you walking past during their conversation." Janet's hands twisted together. The champagne incident was just a convenient excuse. The revelation struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. All these years, she had believed her downfall had been random cruelty, bad luck. To learn it had been deliberate, calculated. "And the flash drive, my email backup?" Elizabeth asked, connecting more dots. "His men found those too?" Agent Donovan interjected. "We believe Richard had been monitoring your activities at Barrett Financial for some time before the confrontation. He recognized the threat you posed, which means he saw you as a worthy opponent," Martha observed, speaking for the first time since introductions. "You scared him, Elizabeth." Sophia reached for her mother's hand under the table, squeezing it tightly. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked, struggling to process everything. "Richard has disappeared," Agent Donovan explained. "We believe he's attempting to flee to a country without extradition. Every airport, seaport, and border crossing is being watched. But with his resources, he has a private island," Janet supplied, "in the Caribbean, technically owned by a shell corporation. But it's his bolt hole, where he always said he'd go if things went south." Agent Donovan made a note. "That's new information. Very helpful. What do you need from us?" Martha asked, ever the pragmatist. "Mrs. Morgan's testimony would strengthen our case considerably," Agent Donovan replied. "Her direct experience of Blackwood's methods, combined with the evidence she gathered, and what Mrs. Blackwood has provided, creates a comprehensive picture of a criminal enterprise spanning decades." Elizabeth considered the implications. Testifying meant public exposure. Her face in newspapers, her name in court records. Everything she had fled from, everything she had protected Sophia from, would come rushing back into their lives. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I need guarantees, protection for my family, and assurance that Richard Blackwood will never threaten us again." The meeting stretched for hours as details were negotiated. Witness protection parameters, immunity, agreements, the timeline for grand jury testimony. By evening, a tentative accord had been reached. Elizabeth, Sophia, and Mrs. Cabrera would remain under federal protection until Richard Blackwood was apprehended. Martha would serve as Elizabeth's legal counsel throughout the process. As they prepared to leave, Janet pulled Elizabeth aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "The night you were fired after you left, Richard was already planning worse than termination. He intended to frame you for theft, ensure you'd never work again." Her eyes held Elizabeth's steadily. "I switched the security footage, replaced it with a recording from the previous day. It bought you time to get away." Elizabeth stared at Janet, reassessing years of assumptions. "Why would you help me?" "Because I saw myself in you," Janet replied simply. "Another woman whose life Richard Blackwood was destroying because he could." That night, in the safe house provided by the FBI, Elizabeth lay awake long after Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera had fallen asleep. The day's revelations swirled in her mind: the deliberate nature of her firing, Janet's surprising intervention, the possibility that justice might finally be within reach. And yet, Richard Blackwood remained at large. Until he was apprehended, the threat remained. Elizabeth rose quietly and moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the federal agents stationed outside. Protection, yes, but also a reminder that she was still not free. Would she ever be, as long as Richard Blackwood drew breath? The answer came 3 days later, with a pre-dawn phone call that jolted Elizabeth from uneasy sleep. "We've got him," Agent Donovan's voice announced without preamble. "Trying to board a private yacht in Miami. He resisted arrest." Elizabeth's heart pounded. "Is he in custody?" Donovan confirmed, "and facing enough charges to ensure he never walks free again." As she hung up, Elizabeth felt a strange sensation. Not the triumph she had imagined during years of building her case, but something quieter, a burden lifting, air-filling lungs that had been compressed for too long. She woke Sophia and Mrs. Cabrera to share the news, their sleepy faces transforming with dawning comprehension. "It's over?" Sophia asked, hope and disbelief mingling in her voice. "Almost," Elizabeth replied. There would still be testimony, trials, the long process of justice grinding forward. But the man who had haunted their lives for so many years was now himself trapped, powerless. As morning light filtered through the safe house windows, Elizabeth Morgan allowed herself, for the first time in 7 years, to contemplate a future without fear. A future built not on running, but on the strength she had discovered within herself during the darkest times. The story of Elizabeth Morgan's triumph over Richard Blackwood became legendary in legal circles, a testament to one woman's extraordinary resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. After Richard was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for his crimes, Elizabeth completed her accounting degree and established a non-profit foundation dedicated to helping victims of corporate abuse. With Janet Blackwood's substantial financial contribution, half of the Blackwood fortune awarded to her in the divorce settlement, the foundation provided legal assistance, education scholarships, and housing support to those whose lives had been devastated by powerful men like Richard. Sophia followed in her mother's footsteps, graduating law school with honors and joining the foundation as its chief legal counsel, while Mrs. Cabrera enjoyed her final years surrounded by the family she had helped protect through their darkest times. Have you been feeling trapped by circumstances beyond your control? Is there someone in your life using their power to make you feel worthless? Elizabeth's journey shows us that no matter how powerful your opponent may seem, persistence and courage can ultimately triumph over cruelty and corruption. Perhaps you've been running from your own Richard Blackwood. Whether it's a toxic relationship, a soul-crushing job, or simply the fear of standing up for yourself, what step could you take today to begin your own transformation story? Remember, Elizabeth's greatest victory wasn't putting Richard behind bars. It was discovering her own strength along the way. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to never miss another life-changing story like this one. And if you want to see another powerful tale of redemption, click on the video appearing on your screen now. Husband left pregnant wife in rural area with old stove. Years later, he fell to his knees in regret for another emotional journey that will inspire you to transform your own life.